Meadowcreek Farm, earlier known as Beaver Creek Farm or Beaver Creek Stock Farm, occupies over 400 acres in Harmony Township, which was originally part of Champaign County. It straddles Section 22 and 23 of Township 6, Range 9, from between the Miami Survey. The modern farm contains most of the property acquired by Samuel Goodfellow in the mid-19th century, as he consolidated parcels purchased from family and neighbors to build what was later called one of the finest farms in Clark County. Samuel was one of 9 children of Moore Goodfellow, one of the earliest white settlers in the township. Moore was born in County Tyrone in Northern Ireland. We'll return to this family tree later to see some interesting connections. Note that Samuel's older brother married Catherine Cassad, who was from the same Greene County family that originally owned one of the Pike Township farms in part 2 of this series. According to family sources, Moore came to America as a lad on a cattle boat, tending the stock, arriving in the port of Baltimore in the late 18th century. From there he made his way into Pennsylvania, where, according to one descendant, he became attached to the household of John Nicholson, with whom he came to Harmony Township. Perhaps there was a hometown connection that led Moore to Nicholson, who was also from Northern Ireland, but no documentation could be found. Nicholson had arrived in Pennsylvania in 1783 and moved to Harmony Township in 1806, bringing, quote, the first flock of sheep, 30 in number, which were decorated with bells to protect them from wolves. At the same time, Mr. Nicholson brought to his Ohio home several cows, a yoke of oxen, and 3 horses. During the first season in their new home, 15 acres of corn were planted, unquote. Note all the firsts for Harmony Township associated with this family: the first marriage among the white settlers, the first school, and the first church. Benjamin Wallingsford was another early white settler, although he appears to have lived in Montgomery County when he purchased land in Harmony Township. It's from some of the purchases listed here that Samuel built his farm. As noted in the article on Clark County firsts, Moore Goodfellow's marriage to John Nicholson's daughter, Isabel, in 1808 was the first recorded marriage in Harmony Township. By the 1820 census shown here, Moore's household consisted of 9 people. According to the 1881 History of Clark County, his offspring with their descendants have held prominence in the township in business, political, and social circles for nearly 3/4 of a century, unquote. Some of these descendants still farm in the township today. Moore was a private in Captain Cox's company, Ohio Militia, during the War of 1812, and became an American citizen in 1828, as this naturalization record shows. There is no documentation for the original log dwellings for the white settlers in the records of Clark County, which was established in 1818. The Goodfellows eventually built a brick house, very likely on the foundation still visible behind the home of the current owners, around 1826, according to this tax record. This is a picture of the Goodfellow house on Buena Vista Road, on property that had belonged to son Thomas Goodfellow. Although the book No Place Like Home, a 2007 architectural history of Springfield and Clark County, says that this house was built in the 1820s, it is more likely that it was modeled on the 1826 house of his parents, but built a bit later, because Thomas was born in 1813 and married in 1840. There was a family burial ground established on the southeast corner of Section 23, originally owned by the Wallingsford family. This land was sold to Moore Goodfellow, who later sold it to Samuel. All the deeds for this parcel specify that 1 acre out of the southwest corner of said quarter section be reserved for the use of a burying ground. Known for many years as the Bennett Nicholson Goodfellow Cemetery, the burial ground may have had as many as 200 graves, including that of Revolutionary War soldier James Hopkins, who died in 1823. There were many years in the 20th century that no one lived on the farm, and the cemetery became overgrown. In 1975, Robert and Ann Snodgrass dug up and read the inscriptions on about 30 headstones and compiled a report. When the burial ground was rechecked in 1998, only a few fragments were found. Several years later, the current owners cleared the area and found as many as 80 headstones. While the owners are careful not to disturb the area, they are unable to keep up with the daunting task of keeping the brush under control, so many of the stones are overgrown, but quite a few of them are still visible among the trees and honeysuckle. The cemetery is not open to the public. The very readable headstone for one William Hall, not listed in the Snodgrass report, was found on the edge of the burial ground in recent years, and now rests beside a barn. The readability of the stones varies greatly, depending on both age and type of stone. The latest date on the Snodgrass inventory is 1851, and it is likely there are no newer graves. Isabel Goodfellow died in 1852, and, like her husband and a number of her children and grandchildren, was buried in Raggs Cemetery on Plattsburgh Road, not far from the Goodfellow farm. This suggests that the Bennett Nicholson Goodfellow Cemetery had reached its capacity by the time she passed away. Samuel Goodfellow married Mahala Jones, daughter of another early settler, in December 1847, as shown in the county records. He had begun to acquire livestock prior to his marriage, listed here in the county's tax records for personal property, and by 1848 had more cattle and hogs and almost as many horses as his father. By the 1850 census, Sam and Mahala had a daughter named Isabel. They had earlier lost another in infancy. From 1848 to 1867, they built their farm from parcels purchased from the Wallingford heirs, Nicholson heirs, Sam's father, and, after Moore's death, from Sam's siblings. Several of them quit claim to land they inherited for $5 each, and others sold him additional acreage that had been bequeathed by Moore. By the time this 1870 atlas was published, the farm was at its largest. In the early years of their marriage, Sam and Mahala probably lived in a frame house that had been built by a member of the Wallingford family, but they built their own larger frame house in 1856 in the southwest corner of Section 23 and continued to raise their growing family there. The household census for 1860 lists sons Milton and Frank in addition to daughter Isabel, now 10. 4-year-old Mary did not survive to adulthood. Son Milton became the postmaster in Plattsburgh in 1879. He worked as a traveling salesman, became the delinquent tax collector for the city of Springfield, and served on the city council for a time. He and his wife, Jenny Ayers, had 4 children: Laura, Elno, Roy, and Ruby. Roy became Clark County treasurer in 1920 after working in that office for a number of years, and he and his wife Ethel were described as, quote, popular factors in the social life of Springfield, unquote, according to one local history. Samuel and Mahala's youngest child, Frank, born in 1859, was a machinist in Springfield, according to the census of 1900. He applied for a number of patents for agricultural machinery. Frank and his wife Kate had 3 children, Bessie, Guy, and Hazel. By the time of the 1910 census, father and son had a bakery in Vienna, now called South Vienna. Other good fellows were always close by Sam and Mahala's farm. His brother Elliot owned the farm just south of his. Eliot passed away in 1871, but his widow Phoebe remained there for several years. Their home is pictured here in a lithograph from an 1875 atlas. The agricultural census of June 1880 shows that Samuel had 6 milk cows and 20 other cattle, made 1,000 pounds of butter in 1879, owned 600 sheep, 11 swine, and 125 barnyard poultry. The farm produced 500 eggs in 1879. Crops consisted of 100 acres of corn, yielding 2,500 bushels, 5 acres of oats, yielding 180 bushels, and 75 acres of wheat, yielding 1,700 bushels. There were 3 acres of apple orchard, with 25 bearing trees. We may wonder about the previous information concerning Milton Goodfellow, and with good reason. The same source from which that excerpt is taken, A Standard History of Springfield and Clark County, claims that Samuel and Mahala settled on their farm, quote, where they passed the remainder of their lives, unquote. But when you look into the primary documents, you will see that in fact the farm was mortgaged for $14,000 in March of 1880, due in 3 years at 8% interest, payable annually. The mortgage was held by David and John Snyder, wealthy landowners and mill operators, who in 1895 donated the land for the Springfield Park that bears their name. Samuel and Mahala did make interest payments to the Snyders in 1881, 82, 83, and 84, but these were difficult years for farmers, as crop prices went down and expenses rose, and the Goodfellows were unable to repay the loan. In March of 1892, the Snyders brought a civil action against them, resulting in a judgment of over $25,000, plus interest from the date of the judgment. Assessors valued the farm for close to $37,000, but the legal requirement was that it sell for just 2/3 of that value in the sheriff's sale that was scheduled for that spring. Fearing that the sale would not bring in enough to cover the judgment, the court ordered the Goodfellows to pay more than $1,500 from the farm's proceeds that year. From the court records, which list the income expected from the land, it appears that Samuel, who turned 74 in 1892, was not farming as actively as he was in the 1880 census. Rent of pasture, landlord's share of 100 acres of wheat, and landlord's share of 65 acres of corn suggest that he was leasing much of the farm. There is no mention of livestock in the court records. Sam had never shied away from borrowing money, but it had usually been from family members. Probate records from his father Moore's estate showed that he owed more than $2,000 to his father in 1860, and he and his son Milton were sued by his late daughter Isabel's children in 1892 for payment on a promissory note for over $3,000. After the sheriff's sale in 1892, it was the Snyder brothers who took over the farm. Sam and Mahala moved into Springfield, where he died in February 1900. Mahala moved in with son Milton, as you can see on the last line of this page from the 1900 federal census. Note that Milton Goodfellow himself was the census taker. Thanks to Julie Goodfellow, we are able to share some photos of the family. This image of Mahala and Mary Sexton Goodfellow, widow of Sam's brother Thomas, was taken at the home of Clara Goodfellow Roberts and dates from the first decade of the 20th century. Julie also supplied the images of Frank and his son's bakery from the same era. David Snyder, who died in 1898, had never married, and John, who died in 1896, was widowed. The Harmony Township farm, the shaded area on this map from the 1894 atlas, was willed to several of their many nieces and nephews. In 1899, the Snyder nieces and nephews collectively quit claim to the land in favor of their cousin Charles. Charles A. Snyder, his wife Edith Leffel Snyder, and their two children were living on the farm at the time of the 1900 census. He had inherited not only the farm, but a substantial amount in bonds, cash, and promissory notes from the estates of his uncles and his father, Christian Snyder, so he was in a position to invest heavily in the property and in livestock. He is listed in the 1910 census as a breeder of draft horses, but he also bred trotters for harness racing, according to the 1909 Yearbook of Trotting and Pacing. He served as a trustee of Harmony Township from 1901 to 1904. In 1911, Charles, widowed and apparently incapacitated, signed the farm over to his children, Mabel McIntyre and Leroy Snyder, while retaining a life interest in the property. In 1915, he gave them the land outright, and they promptly sold it. Property taxes for 1915 were paid by a Mr. Zimmerman, one of Snyder's lawyers. This appears to be Charles B. Zimmerman, a native of Springfield, who became a justice on Ohio's Supreme Court. Another interesting connection. Sam and Mahala's granddaughter Hazel, daughter of their youngest son Frank, was married to Charles Snyder's son Leroy. Here, Hazel is listed in the 1910 census for the Charles Snyder household as daughter-in-law. The buyer of the property was real estate agent and builder Harry S. Kissel, acting on behalf of Harvey Edgar Myers, who had retired as secretary of the Robbins and Myers Company in Springfield to devote himself to the raising of fine stock and enjoying farm life, states this article in the Springfield newspaper. Reporting on the change of ownership, the article indicates that the farm, quote, contains modern buildings. On the Snyder farm, there are modern buildings, the homestead, 2 tenant houses, a large bank barn, and other buildings. The report claims that the deal was one of the largest in farmlands during the year. Those who know the tract state it is one of the finest farms in Clark County, unquote. Myers was in his 40s in 1915 and not in the best of health. Property tax records during his years of ownership reveal that he made quite an investment in the farm, adding buildings and probably expanding and renovating the barn that is still on the property. The original barn, built around 1880, and possibly one of the reasons for Sam Goodfellow's mortgage, was probably only 3 bays. The remaining cupola on this barn, as well as one on a barn north of US 40 that was once part of the Goodfellow farm, carry the date 1916. They are Buckeye cupolas made by the Thomas and Armstrong Company of London in neighboring Madison County. Advertisements in the 1916 issues of the magazine Country Gentleman and American Builder show that the company was actively marketing to both landowners and building contractors at this time. These renovations may have proved too costly for Myers. He had taken out mortgages on this and other property in 1916 and borrowed even more in 1920. In 1921, American Trust and Savings assumed ownership of the farm. Myers, now certainly in failing health, moved to South Vienna, where he died in 1924. In 1924, American Trust and Savings sold the farm to George Lehnert, originally from Germany, who had farmed for a number of years in Alabama. He is listed in the 1930 census at this location, with general farming given as his occupation. According to his obituary, he bred Belgian horses and Hereford cattle and raised hogs and sheep extensively. Maynard died in 1938, leaving the land to his widow Christiana and their son William. Christiana died in 1940, and in 1942 William sold the land to Horace Leffel Highstand, a cousin of Edith Leffel Snyder. Highstand lived on National Road in Aberfelda, west of Springfield. When you drive out near Donnellsville, you can see a subdivision with the sign Highstand Estates, probably the location of his home farm. Highstand was a doctor who, as his obituary states, was also a horseman and a farmer. He owned land in several areas of Clark and Greene counties, and may have intended to raise some of his championship trotters on this property. But he was in failing health for several years before his death in 1948, and he sold the farm in 1943 to Ernest and Electra Wheeler. The Wheelers, who resided in Madison County, owned the farm until 1949, when they sold it to Fred and Frances Walker. It was during this period that easements for the widening of U.S. Route 40 and roadside park purposes by the Ohio Department of Highways took effect. The Harmony Outpost for ODOT's Highway Maintenance Program is on one parcel of this land between the eastbound and westbound lanes. The reason for the widely divided highway at this particular point is remembered by local landowners. One influential householder along the highway, a colonel in the Ohio National Guard, used his influence in Columbus to make sure that the road was routed around his land. His yard remained intact for many years, while one neighbor had to move his house and barn, and others had land seized under eminent domain. In 1950, the Walkers sold the farm to widower Christian Baldenhofer of Springfield, president and treasurer of Thompson Grinder Company. Baldenhofer sold a small portion of the farm north of US 40 in 1952. This is currently the Crawford Campgrounds. When Christian died in 1953, he left the farm to his 3 children, with 2 of them signing over the property to their brother Ralph. There's no evidence that Ralph lived on the farm, and it's likely that he leased it for crop growing. His obituary indicates that, like his father, he was president of the Thompson Grinder Company, and it appears that he remained active in the affairs of the company and in many organizations in the city of Springfield, but not in farming. It is clear, however, that the farm was actively worked, as there were significant improvements made to the barn in these years. After Ralph's death, the farm was transferred to the Huntington National Bank of Columbus as executor of his estate. Clark County Auditor's records show that Huntington Bank paid the taxes on the property until they transferred the farm to Park National Bank in November of 1992. A few days later, it was purchased by William and Fern Hancock, who raised cattle for a number of years. Hancock experimented with a crossbreeding of Chianina and Angus, called Ankina, a breed still raised in Ohio. Born in 1916, Hancock considered that same year on the barn's cupola was a good omen when he first saw the farm. Meadowcreek Farm was left to the Hancocks' children. Today, one parcel is owned by Elaine and Mark Terrell, and they co-own the other with Elaine's sister, Louise Beach. The tillable sections of the land are planted in corn, soybeans, and hay, and the remainder of this beautiful property contains pasture, woods, creeks, and a pond. It is one of nearly 20 farms in Harmony Township that have been preserved thanks to the foresight of their owners. Join us for the next in this series, when we will look at the farm now known as Agraria. This is Kim Iconis for the Tecumseh Land Trust.